Hi, that was me desperately trying to find out how to delete an AWS account using the API. I couldn't do it, but I found somebody who can.
Hi, I'm Stefan. I'm Tech Lead at MeshCloud, and today we are going to have a look at deleting AWS accounts via the API. In this video, we will have a look at some interesting facts about closing an AWS account. We will create an IAM user with the right permissions to execute the closing of the account, and we will do the call via the API, and in there we will have one important aspect that is missing in the AWS documentation to actually execute this call. What will actually happen when you close an AWS account? Before closing an AWS account, you should always terminate all resources because otherwise you might be charged for them. When closing the account, AWS does not guarantee to terminate all the resources. You may also wonder what happens if you actually notice, oh, I closed that account by accident, I want to recover it. And you can actually do so by writing to the AWS support. All resources that had been available before closing the account will be available again after reopening the account. If you are using AWS Control Tower, you have to unmanage your account first in AWS Control Tower. Afterwards, you can close the AWS account. We will now create an IAM policy with a permission to close an account, and we will create an IAM user that gets this policy assigned. In the AWS Web Console, we will search for IAM and go to that section. In here, we've got the policies section, and we will create a new policy. Therefore, we have to choose a service. The closing an account is part of the organization's service. What we want is a write operation, and that's close account. Additionally, we will add a permission to list accounts that makes it more simple to later on verify that we can actually call the API in general. We also have to define resources that are affected by this policy. As we want to be able to close all accounts in our root account, we have to select all resources. Regarding tags, we don't want to add anything here. And now we get an overview and provide a name for it. Let's call it Account Closing Policy. Now we can check again that everything is correct and create the policy. Next, we have to create a user. Therefore, we click Add User. Therefore, we create our deletion dude user. As a credential type, we select access key as we want some programmatic access to call the API. Now we have to set the permissions for the user, and we created our policy, which we are searching for now. So the account closing policy. That's the only permission this user shall have. Regarding tags, we don't have to do anything, and we create the user. Now we see that the deletion user was created, and we have to store the access key and the secret key securely in, for example, a password manager. Now I opened up Postman to do the call against the API. I already created a Postman collection in here called AWS Account Deletion. You will also find a link to this collection in the description below. We will first add a request to the list endpoint in order to test that authentication is working as expected. As a URL, we just have to enter the URL for the organization's API. Everything else will be handled via headers. There are no specific resources defined in the URL for the different actions you can do on that API. It's all handled via headers. You can find the URL, headers, and everything I put in here also in the description below. In order to tell the organization's API which action you want to call, you have to go to the headers and add an additional XAM set target header. The value must be set to AWS organizations with a certain version, and the list accounts action is what we want to call first. One strange thing about the organization's API in AWS is that we have to use the HTTP verb post to actually get data. We only want to list accounts where we would expect to use get, but the API defines that it's only available via post. And therefore, we also have to define a body in here. So we have to set an empty JSON object in here to execute the call. Now let's try executing this call. Sadly, we get an error that it's an unknown operation. But we did everything as it is documented in the AWS documentation. Sadly, they are missing one central part here, because you also have to add a content type header. Now let's try executing the call again. Okay, as expected, we have to add authentication to our request. So let's go to the authorization tab, add our authorization information. Postman provides an AWS signature type, which makes it easy to generate the signature that is required to call an AWS API. If you look at the AWS documentation about how to create such a signature manually, you will be lost in many, many steps. So it is great to just enter the essential information in here and then you're good to go. Even if you're using the AWS SDK or AWS CLI, this will all be provided to you and you only have to provide this general information that you see here. So let's enter the access key and the secret key of the IAM user we created before. As a region, we always have to select US East 1 as the organization's API. It's just the central API that is cross-region, and US East 1 is the default that is used for that by AWS. The service we are using here is the organization service. So as we now added the authorization information, let's see whether our call is successful. And here we've got our response. So now we are good to go and close the account. As we can now successfully call the organization's API, let's copy our request and do the delete call. One thing we have to change here is the header with the action that we want to call. So it's not going to be list accounts in that case, but it's close account. We also have to change the body because now we have to provide the account that we actually want to delete. And that's account ID and the ID of the account. We actually have a great candidate that was accidentally created by an end-to-end test and we want to delete that account. So let's execute this call. And we can see status is 200 OK. So we successfully closed this account now. So let's just have a quick look into the AWS console to actually see that this was successfully done. So I already have the account open in the AWS console. Let's do a page reload. And we can see that this account has been suspended. In this video, we used an IAM user that lives in the root account. In many cases where you build an automation tool that does more than only closing the account, it might make sense to create something like an automation account where also this IAM user is living. You can create a role in the root account that can be assumed by the IAM user in your automation account. Assuming this role is only allowed to IAM users that have been added to a trust relationship. So you can make sure that only IAM users who shall access the role in the root account can actually do so. We will also provide a video about how to assume such a role via the API. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.